We should be live in a second, Chairman, and Mr. Dossad is just joining us.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. If I could just therefore remind everyone to remain on mute, except when they're speaking, I'd be very grateful. And just remind everyone that we are live on YouTube. I'd like to welcome you all. Good evening to Cabinet Advisory Panel B, Head of Cabinet this coming Thursday. Welcome to councillors and officers. Appreciate you taking the time to attend. The apologies that I'm aware of are Councillor Gaskin and Councillor Perfect. Are we happy to note that? Is there any other apologies that anyone is aware of? Okay, thank you, noted. Are there any declarations of interest? I cannot see anyone indicating. The minutes are in the pack. They are for the Cabinet to confirm, not for us to confirm. Are there any comments on the minutes of the last Cabinet? I can't see anyone indicating. There are no urgent items for this meeting. Cabinet, just to remind you, Cabinet will get the minutes of this meeting when they meet on Thursday. There's no references to this committee from any other committee. None of the B agenda or C agenda items have been called down for discussion. Therefore, we will note those items. I will list them when we get to them. The first item is item 7, the draft antisocial behaviour policy. I believe Mr. Eady is attending for this item. Is there anything you'd like to say, Mr. Eady, or should we just see if there's any comments on this item? Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. I have prepared some brief introductory remarks for the policy, if that's okay. I'll just read them through now. So I really wanted to say welcome to the first post-spring Cabinet. The ASB policy was last updated in 2015 and was therefore long overdue for a review. Sorry, can people hear me okay? Yeah, cool. The policy covers 3 council services instrumental in delivering the council's response to antisocial behaviour: the Community Safety Unit, Environmental Health and Housing. It also mentions the role of the police as the principal agency for incidents of antisocial behaviour that are a criminal offence and reports of hate crime and domestic abuse. In covering so much ground, members will note the significant amount of legislation and statutory guidance it's compatible with. I think 30 are referred to. And in addition to that, there's specific policies in each of the service areas linked to ASB. So it's a huge kind of area. One issue the policy does try to address is to clarify where reports of ASB should go, as it's not always clear who to report incidents to and who will take the lead responsibility for managing them. That's a point that was picked up in the government's recent white paper, A Charter for Social Housing Residents. As a social landlord, housing is also required to provide an ASB policy and procedure statement, and this is incorporated in this policy. It was actually in the last one as well, in 2015. The policy aims to provide reassurance that regardless of where a report is made, it will be dealt with due to the strong working partnership between the council departments and the police. I hope members feel that despite the underlying complexity, it has achieved its aim of bringing clarity for those who read the policy. Members will note that the Cabinet report accompanying the policy details the main updates, including details of partnership working, how to report ASB, the roles and responsibilities of the CSU, Environmental Health and Housing, in tackling ASB. It also details the support for victims and witnesses and protection and support for vulnerable people, details of how to request an ASB case review, and training and monitoring issues. In updating the actions and powers to deal with antisocial behaviour, it references the measures introduced by the government during the COVID pandemic. Members recall the impact of COVID being mentioned when the rent arrears policy was discussed recently, and how that led to the prolongation of notice periods and suspension of evictions. Despite this and the council offices being closed for large periods over the last 12 months, the council has adapted its working methods and carried on working effectively throughout this period. One mechanism for enabling this to happen is the CSU daily tasking meetings currently held virtually and referred to in the policy, where information is shared to enable effective remedies to be taken to deal with reported antisocial behaviour. This close working relationship has been pivotal in dealing with the spike in ASB during the pandemic, that I think I read was something like 160% increased in North Kent. Members may be interested to note that a further housing officer is currently being recruited by the Housing Estates Management team to help deal with this increase in antisocial behaviour. Housing software has also been procured. An antisocial behaviour model is being developed that will assist housing in delivering a robust response to antisocial behaviour in the borough. The policy will also be reviewed in 12 months' time, and there are two reasons for this. Firstly, in the light of the changed circumstances surrounding court proceedings during the COVID pandemic. Secondly, due to the changes anticipated to the obligations of social landlords through the government's white paper. Performance measures have not been confirmed yet, but the white paper does list them in draft as follows: the number of complaints relating to antisocial behaviour relative to the size of the landlord, tenant satisfaction with landlord's handling of antisocial behaviour. That's therefore a brief introduction to the policy. I hope members have found that useful, and of course we'll be happy to take questions from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Eady. Can you please clearly indicate if you wish to comment? So I've got Councillor Ben Musa first and then Councillor Grian. Is there anyone else that wishes to speak on this? We'll go to Councillor Ben Musa first. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions, David. On 6.52, I wondered if it was possible to put in misogyny is also a hate crime, as the council did raise that at GAC. And it says at 11.2, an officer is assigned to the victim to explain the process and regular contact. Is that one of the HEM team? And then the third one is, say there is antisocial behaviour from one of our tenants and they live next door to a private renter. Can that advice pack be given to a private renter as well, i.e. the diary, the noise app, etc.? Do they get given advice that they can log things with us as well? And finally, domestic abuse, is that reported through the CSU portal or is that directly to the housing officer? Thank you.
So I'm just getting used to this muting and unmuting business. So the first point about misogyny being a hate crime, I mean, in terms of the policy itself, I mean, it is meant to be comprehensive. I think that the fact that you raise this shows that it probably hasn't covered absolutely every single thing it could cover. From my own point of view, I don't have a particular issue with items being added to the policy. I'll ask perhaps for Mr. Dosad, who may wish to comment on that particular point, but it is meant to be comprehensive and cover all the areas, and if there is a gap, we would want to fill that gap basically. So I think also it has been based on best guidance. We've taken account of the Ombudsman suggestions around antisocial behaviour, and I think basically we would ensure that things are covered and we pick up on the issues, whatever the kind of hate crime we are dealing with. But if a specific category would help us dealing with the issue, we could certainly look at that. Did you want to make a comment on that, Peter?
Thank you, through the chair. Yes, I think in answer to the question is a simple yes. I think it's not a new problem, unfortunately, but it's a relatively new definition as a hate crime, as you say. So we're absolutely happy to add that, and it should be included in the policy. So we'll put that proposal forward to Cabinet. Sorry. Thank you, Peter. On the second point, in terms of the reporting, since the last policy was done, I think we've sort of had some changes really in how we deal with ASB in some respects. I mean, there's an awful lot more stuff done online. I mean, the old days when I started 30 years ago, people sending letters about this sort of thing, but
but emails are now obviously one of the things which are hugely increased. There's an ASB HEM email address which has been set up for this very purpose, to actually help people report ASB, because that's very helpful to us, because we can be more responsive. We can also encourage people to send in evidence with that too, so it helps us deal with cases. And also with the new software we're getting, I mean, we'll be able to actually make sure we open the case up and we add that kind of stuff to it too. But yeah, it is HEM, it's the Housing Estate Management team that are the lead officers in dealing with reported ASB from a housing perspective. I did, I think, point out that the other, if it's for example, an entirely privately owned premises, for example, it will be the CSU that takes the lead. So it does vary to some degree depending on what the circumstances of the issue are, if that helps. I mean, coming on to that point about private renting is interesting. I think what we do want to do is to make sure that we act as a team. So certainly if there was a private renter involved, we'd be picking that up, and I think we'd take the case forward. We would be able to, so obviously we'll be guided by the CSU's perhaps potential knowledge of that case, as it is a private sector accommodation. But I think the whole thrust of the policy, and the reason why we've done so well in Dartford in tackling ASB, is because we actually work across the team so well with the community safety unit's role in coordinating our work. So that's proved very effective. I can't remember when the CSU was created, but for many years that's proved very effective. And that partnership working still carries on. So what we don't want to do is to enable a victim to actually struggle simply because it's gone to one team and not the other. But certainly they'll be very closely linked, and we certainly look at a linked case, I think, in dealing with that sort of issue. The final point about domestic abuse, I mean, yeah, I think the policy makes reference to domestic abuse in terms of the role the police have in these sorts of issues themselves. I mean, we have clearly high level reporting of domestic abuse, but we would pick up and deal with DA cases. Certainly as a social landlord, if somebody's involved as one of our tenants, we'll pick it up and deal with potential needs for alternative accommodation. We have, as we probably know, been an increase in DA incidents being reported, but we would pick up on those sorts of cases and make sure that the people involved perhaps were assisted in obtaining a refuge place or whatever it was to find accommodation. Where obviously housing is all about accommodation, so we'll get involved in from that perspective. But so I hope that kind of answers your queries, Councillor Ben Musa. Sorry, your hand's up.
Thank you, Mr. Eadie. Can I just remind councillors that it's for the Cabinet to decide if any amendments are made to the policy, not for officers to decide that. I have, sorry, Councillor Ben Musa, did you want to ask another question?
No, I just wanted to come back on the DA thing. Sometimes victims of DA don't want to report directly to the police, but they are a council tenant and they're in trouble. I was looking for some advice on whether they would be able to contact their HEM team to say secure their property, or would they just have to go through the police and then the police would then contact Dartford Borough Council?
Yeah, again, I think of course we will be involved in any of the issues around accommodation as a landlord. We have an obligation to our tenants, and if they are suffering from domestic abuse, it's our priority to make sure we help deal with that and support them in terms of whatever support needs they've got. I mean, I think certainly, to say there is a role for the police sometimes in dealing with these sorts of issues, but I think it's clear that from a housing perspective, our concern that has been for many years is to make sure that victims of domestic abuse have a soft landing in terms of how they're picked up and supported to actually go through the extremely difficult path they are on with their partners to leave them and to move forwards, etc. So, we will certainly take a very significant lead in making sure that matter is resolved for them.
Thank you. I have Councillor Green, then Councillor Oakley-Dale, then Councillor Moat. Councillor Green, thank you.
Thank you. When I was reading the policy, obviously I was struck by the lengthy nature of it, which of course I'm not criticising at all. That's absolutely necessary. I think for people that are suffering antisocial behaviour, it's a very overwhelming experience, and it's very difficult to know where to go through for help. So what I'd like to suggest, particularly when I was looking at page 8, which has got the roles and responsibilities on. If we could have some sort of document, or ideally some sort of thing where you would click in on the website and it would tell you who to go to and where to go to, depending on the type of antisocial behaviour you're experiencing, I think that would be really helpful, because my experience is a lot of people are overwhelmed and confused and don't know where to go. So anything we could do to try and make this document, what's the word, kind of applicable to people, make it usable for people, I think will be really, really appreciated.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. I'm sure we can look at that. I think what we do want to do is to make sure that the pathways for reporting ASB are made as straightforward as possible. So what we're going to do is to capture the issue in terms of what we have got in this borough. So anything that facilitates and supports us doing that would be something we'd certainly look at. I think it is clear the CSU does have a kind of a coordinating role in terms of the overall kind of reporting of ASB, but we're always, I think, looking at how we can actually make it less complicated to report this. And I think as you said, it is a lengthy document. I think that's inevitable when you look at the number of areas we actually have to look at. But certainly, leading on from that, if we can try and simplify the process, we'll certainly have a look to see how we can take that forward, that suggestion forward.
I think as well, if I could just come back on that, is what we know is that different communities need kind of different routes into getting help quite often, and I think it'd be really useful if we could have conversations with people from different communities and find out the best way for them to access this kind of help, support and advice. And just I think having one route into things is really problematic, and that's something I would like us to look at a bit more closely.
Thank you. Noted.
Right, thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Reid, did you want to reply to that? Or?
I don't think so. I think, as I say, I think it's certainly something which we want to encourage. I mean, there is I think it's a customer access review. I think certainly that whole issue around diversity is something which we are always looking at too, in terms of ensuring the Dartford resident population is able to actually have its voice heard.
Thank you. Councillor Oakley-Dow. You're on mute, Councillor Oakley-Dow.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Chair. My question would be with reference to the second recommendation. Would it be possible to get an outline of the circumstances that could be foreseen whereby delegated authority would be necessary to approve any further amendments? What is the purpose of that recommendation? What is the context?
Mr. Dosed, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think that's more around what might be coming out of the white paper. I think in terms of the delegated responsibilities down to us as a council. I think going back to the original comment about how long and complicated the document is, harks to that and meeting our statutory responsibilities and the wide range in nature of ASB, from some pretty low level stuff to some very, very serious, effectively is a crime and it should be dealt with rightly so. So I think it's around that, and I think it's about us being able to be flexible and adaptive. I think we're concerned what might happen in the post-COVID world. This is just one of the issues in terms of the fallout in terms of antisocial behaviour, and I guess it's more about operationally what we might be able to do to react and provide a better service to those residents that are suffering from antisocial behaviour in whatever form. And I think sort of going back to an earlier question about getting the message out, and I think that's very much part of the next phase once Cabinet approves, and I think that will also potentially pick up some issues that may need delegated authority to change if we find that we're not dealing with it in the right way. The fact of the matter is we've struggled to do the consultation because of the nature of the world currently, and there may be that there's something we've missed, and it's an honest approach to that. If it was anything fundamental, then clearly we would be coming back to Cabinet for members, because it's it's such an important document to us that we want to get it right. So that's the kind of approach. But rest assured, if there was anything substantial, we'd be right back here seeking members' views and input.
Thank you. That's good. It's good to hear that. Thank you for the reassurance. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Councillor Moat.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the Housing Department for a very as always, an extremely comprehensive report. A lot to it, a lot of meat in there. And I think we all recognise the extent to which ASB has rocketed in some of our properties during the pandemic. So well done to the team that's been working on that. Strange enough, Mr. Dosad, as he always does, has knocked the wind out of my sails in his favourite expression, getting the message out. Because the one question I was going to ask was that how do we, and forgive me if I've missed this in the actual review, and it's probably useful if other people are listening into this, how do we intend to let people know what the new arrangements are? We've talked about how we can, how they can get in touch with us. I think Councillor Graham, extremely good point about the links with the website, etc. But how are we going to actually let the people know in our properties how they can actually trigger things like the community trigger, for instance? And I was just wondering if there is a process of rollout that we are going to get this messaging, this communications out. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's going to be a combination of approaches. I think we're going to go back to the old school. There's a link that's in preparation currently. That's the tenants and leaseholders newsletter. So that will certainly get the information out. We're talking to the Citizen of Advice team. Tony Carter in the homeless team has got some very good tentacles into the domestic abuse support services. But what we're looking to do is to come up with a communications plan that will actually deliver it on a bit more of a seamless approach than we've had before. Obviously, the website will be updated. What we'd like to have is a very straightforward website page, which picks up Councillor Moose's point about having an easy click and getting where you want to go, and Councillor Graham's point. So there's a multitude of ways we want to do it, but ultimately, this is going to be having very easy access to us, and then enable us to push the cases into the areas that can provide the best support, be that, you know, external support services or the police if it's a criminal element, that kind of stuff. But David and Sarah will be working on the comms plan in the next couple of weeks once we've have cabinet approval, hopefully.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? I would like to ask that the Cabinet consider adding to the policy that everyone will get a unique reference number when they report incidents of antisocial behaviour. I think that happens anyway, but I think it would be reassuring if that was mentioned in the policy, because I think it does provide reassurance to people that if they've got a reference number, that it's easier to track down the audit trail. Thank you very much, Mr. Eady. I'm not sure if you're remaining for other items or not. Feel free to stay on or leave entirely as appropriate. Moving on, agenda item 8 is the draft private sector housing enforcement and licensing policy. I believe that Ms. Evans is attending for this item. Is there anything you'd like to introduce? Please do so. Thank you.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Yeah, just a couple of sort of highlights I just wanted to outline to you. This is about the fourth version of the private sector housing enforcement policy, the last version being in 2018. We've brought the update to you because there has been more legislation and more meat on the bones on previous legislation that we needed to get embodied within the enforcement policy. We've also tried to give it a little bit of a tidy up and some sort of smart clicks and links to make it more user friendly, because I am aware that it is a weighty tone and that reflects the legislation, I'm afraid. So the main highlights of this update refer to the electrical safety standards in private rented sector and to the energy efficiency standards. So I just wanted to mention a couple of things about the electrical safety standards, which is a completely new piece of legislation. Prior to this, private rented properties that were rented in the single household, so a family unit, there weren't any clear-cut electrical requirements for landlords in comparison to the HMO, so the shared accommodation, where landlords have to have an electrical installation condition report completed every 5 years. So there was this disparity between the two types of tenancy. So this has brought the single household tenants in line with the shared accommodation type tenancies. So landlords are now obliged to have a every 5 years an electrical inspection report completed and works carried out to bring that property up to standard. The actual legislation lays down the process for the local authority to take action against the landlord who isn't doing what he should do. So there's options available. If it's a serious issue, the council can actually go in and do the works in place of the landlord, and the landlord will get a charge for that. If it's less serious, we can serve a remedial notice and give the landlord time period within which to do the works. In either case, we do have further enforcement powers where we can actually impose financial penalties against the landlord that's breaching the legislation. That's outlined in the policy. We try to be as fair and as clear, as transparent as we can be with that. And there are various scenarios and ways in which we will decide on what the actual penalty will be. Moving on, and there is obviously an appeals process for the landlords, both to the council and to the private sector, tribunal, the housing tribunal as well. So that's the electrical safety standards. The energy efficiency private rented sector regulations were already in place, but there has been some changes to that. Previously, if a landlord could not bring basically property needs to be a grade E of an EPC for it to be able to be rented now. Previously, the legislation allowed the landlord to leave it as an E or below an E if he had to spend money himself to actually do the work, if there weren't any grants or discounts and so on available to the landlord. That has been tweaked to allow a landlord, they have to spend a maximum of £3,500 plus what else they can get. So works up to £3,500 are now included, which is good. It's also, we'd previously given information about the types of penalties that were available, but we've now put the meat on the bones of those penalties and actually tied that up with other penalties that are in the policy, so they should be laid out as well. So it was just an addition really to the pre-existing legislation, and just going that little bit further and saying that we are going to put penalties against landlords that aren't complying. This is an important issue. We need to make sure that residents in Dartford, on both these pieces of legislation, residents of Dartford are safe and warm, and the landlords are doing what they should be doing in the borough.
Thank you very much. Could you please clearly indicate if you wish to speak? I have Councillor Ben Musa first. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Rachel. It was just a question, really. I didn't know if there was, I'm not sure that many people know that it's the council that enforces this in the first place. If we had something on a website that explained that, and if we don't, is there a possible way for people to report their landlords to the council online? Because I've got to be honest with you, I tend to deal with our own stock and my landlord's on the ball, but I didn't know about this until I read the policy. So I'm not sure how many other people would know that we are able to do something about it if they're having to live like that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we do have pages on the council website about being a private tenant. We do have information available to tenants and landlords. The enforcement policy is already in there and obviously will be updated. We do give presentations where we can. We've given presentations recently to Works and Pension. We do try and get the word out there, but it does come to quite a shock to some people that we actually do deal with private properties within the council. It's one of those ones that we do keep, digging away and trying to promote ourselves. But yeah, I understand what you're saying, that people are sometimes surprised. Fortunately, people like the Citizens Advice Bureau and Shelter and local solicitors that specialise in housing are aware of this, and they do signpost and put people through to us as well. And quite often we'll get a general inquiry through housing services inquiry systems, which will then pop into our inbox, and we will deal with. And there is access on the website to send in email inquiries to us. We've got our phone number and so on there as well.
Thank you. So is it possible for me to get hold of the link to that page, and then councillors can promote it, can't they, on their own, so more people can learn about it?
Yeah, I'd be more than welcome. The more that people know, the better, really, because we obviously want to, ensure that people are living, in a proper, safe, warm environment.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? The only comment I've got is that, not so much about the policy, but if I was in the cabinet, there's no context in the report. I think I'd be interested to know how many houses of multiple occupancy there are in the borough, how many enforcement actions we take each year, how many demolition orders we've issued, and so on. So I'll leave that for them to decide if they need that context. But I thought that would have been interesting to see that sort of context. I'm quite happy with the policy. Councillor Moat.
Thanks, Chairman. I think one of the things we may be looking at in the near future is a strategic housing paper, which may well embrace some of these statistics. So it is something that's been worked on, but at the moment we are waiting for things like the census, etc., to pass us by, or to happen before we start putting together any great numbers, because it would be daft to do anything like that with reference to housing until such time as these numbers are in place and we can actually start building some fairly useful statistics. But your point is absolutely spot on, but it is, I think, something that we're looking at, but it's something a little bit down the line.
Councillor Jones, good to see you, Councillor Jones.
Thank you, Chair. I like what Rachel was saying in terms of signposting things to the council when things aren't going right for tenants in the private sector. But I just wondered whether there was any experience around people that are afraid to do that, have been worried about that as a result of their rent going up or their tenancy not being renewed. And if that is the case, what lessons could we learn from that in terms of supporting those people?
I can comment on some of that, in that private tenants are protected from a retaliatory eviction under the legislation, in that if we as the local authority are advised of a problem in a property in the borough, we will go out and inspect it under the Housing Act, under something called Housing Health and Safety Rating System. If we deem that there are problems in this property, there's up to 29 different hazards we have to look at, there's serious problems, we can take formal enforcement action, which is outlined in the policy. And that could include things like an improvement notice, or even a prohibition order, or us doing works in default. Once there's some sort of action is being taken against the landlord, retaliatory eviction is then prevented for 6 months. It stops the private landlord from serving a Section 21 notice for a 6-month period from when we kick off with our enforcement. So there is a level of protection for that. I hear what you're saying. We get it regularly from tenants that they want to tell us about the problem, but then they won't empower us to actually take further action in some cases, because they are concerned about things like rent increases and so on. There is so much we can do to support the tenant in those sort of circumstances, and it is the peril that the risk you take, unfortunately. But I think that the good outweighs the bad, in the fact that someone needs to stand up and take action if landlords are totally disregarding the law. And we've got residents living in really dire situations in some cases. And in those cases, we do sometimes have to do something, even if the tenant doesn't actually want us to, because it is so dangerous. We can't leave someone in that situation.
Thank you, Rachel. It was really good to hear that. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Again, you're welcome to leave or to stay on as you see fit. Thank you very much for introducing that item. Move on to agenda item 9. I believe Mr. Dosad is attending for this one. This is the external wall insulation works. Would you like to introduce it, please, Mr. Dosad? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very short report following two very, very long reports, so you'll be pleased to hear. I mean, this essentially is good news. We, through Sandra Woodfall in her role as Environmental Promotions Officer role, made a successful bid for some additional funding to build on our very successful external wall insulation programme. And in terms of the timeframes which these grants inevitably delivered with are very, very stretching, I think is the nicest way to put it. The only way we're going to deliver this is to actually bolt it onto our existing contract. So the report itself talks about the strategic director approving a waiver that enables the director award, add to our programme and build on a very successful programme which not only helps in terms of the energy efficiency of our properties, but our residents are experiencing some significant savings on their energy bills. So it's a very positive programme, something we're looking to continue into the coming years, because by the end of this, we'll probably be halfway through our 800 difficult to heat solid wall properties, and members are asked to know the contents of the report. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions or comments? I can't see anything. I've got one myself. It says that we have to commence works by the end of March. I'm just wondering when was the council aware that we're getting money? Because I'm slightly concerned that we're not tendering for such a large contract. Thank you.
A week before last, we were notified that we had the money. Urgent report to the strategic director. Urgent report to get it on tonight's agenda.
Okay.
And unfortunately, it's almost always the case with these grants that the time scales are just very, very difficult. And unfortunately, the only way we can deliver it, Chair, is by bolting it onto our existing contract, which was tendered competitively. And what I will say is that the rates are exactly the same and were competitive when it was last tendered, I think it was about 18 months ago.
Okay, thank you. We can build the wall in that case. Moving on, I think we're staying with Mr. Dosad for agenda item number 10, which is the sheltered housing alarm installation. Mr. Dosad, thank you.
Yes, another very straightforward report, I hope. After the tragedy at Grenfell, we embarked on a very robust fire safety audit. Did quite a lot of work to the general needs properties and also to the 12 sheltered housing schemes, which culminated in a joint inspection with the Kent Fire and Rescue Services. They have raised a number of issues with us that previously weren't raised in the standard inspections. However, we feel it's absolutely imperative that we get the works organised as quickly as possible and make sure that the residents of our housing schemes are as safe as they possibly can be in terms of their fire safety. So the report effectively just looks to notify Cabinet that this is a key decision because the expenditure on the eventual tender and successful contractor will exceed £500,000, and we're looking to tender very shortly and get the works going as soon as we possibly can.
Does anyone have any questions or comments on this item? I can't see any. I myself do. I think the budget is for £1 million. Whilst I fully support fire safety, presumably the current system will alert the fire brigade and it will alert the tenant, and the upgrade seems to be to allow communication between the tenant and the call handler, which is that whilst I support spending money on fire safety, is that value for money for the additional functionality for a budget of £1 million is what I suppose I'm asking. Thank you.
It isn't just that. The link in terms of the way the system works is a link system, which is slightly different to the way it previously had to work. And the first thing I would say is this isn't a comment on the fact that our current systems are not safe or fit for purpose. What you have is a Kent Fire and Rescue Service that are obviously very anxious to make sure that those that are deemed vulnerable, and that's effectively the people that live in our housing schemes, have the absolutely safest system in terms of their communication. The added issue with the fire brigade is that they obviously there is an expense every time they are called out. So what the expectation is that they will only be called out for valid calls. The concern from the fire brigade is if the alarm goes off and they turn up and there hasn't been a communication with the tenant to say this is a legitimate call, because unfortunately by the nature of some of the residents that reside in the units, the calls are not always reflective of an emergency, put it that way. So it's kind of building out some of their time. So in terms of value for money, I would argue that there's two prongs to that. Ensuring our residents are safe has to be 100% value for money. I absolutely support that. Whether or not a communication system is worth £1 million over 12 schemes, over 400 units, I think that's a decision that we had to make.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dosad. I can't see anyone else indicating, so we'll move on to agenda item 11, which is the consultation on changes to the National Policy Planning Framework. Ms. Collins, would you like to introduce the report, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just a short introduction. This is a consultation by government on the proposed National Model Design Code, and also some text changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, which members will know we use in decision making on planning applications. It basically takes account, the changes take account really of the need to put more emphasis, or the requirement to put emphasis on good design, and that's what the National Model Design Code is about as well. It also encompasses some changes that have arisen through evolving case law as well. So the proposed response report supports and welcomes most of the changes. There's just a couple where we've sought more clarity on the wording to avoid any issues in the future, and the report identifies those. The response also identifies the resource implications for the council should the need to produce national design codes come forward, and certainly the changes in the NPPF that are proposed will put more emphasis on those, and probably the need for the council to produce them. So I would just ask members to note the proposed responses. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to comment or ask any questions on this item? I can't see anyone. Where are we at with our current plan? I'm just wondering whether this would impact our current plan, which we approved at GAC, or not, just out of interest. Thank you.
It doesn't. I mean, we have a strong design policy in the plan, and that would support us if we wanted to produce design codes. So we can, and the design codes are a supplementary planning document, so they sit under the local plan, and certainly the new local plan allows for that to be done.
Thank you. I can't see anyone else indicating. So thank you very much for presenting that item. The other items which I'll list in a moment are all on agenda B and C, so we'll and have not been called down. So it's a strategic asset management plan will be considered by the cabinet, the new town centre parking, risk-based verification of welfare, and council tax hardship scheme. That's it. I'd like to again thank the officers for attending the meeting, and the minutes of this meeting and the discussion therein will be available to the cabinet when they meet on Thursday to discuss it. Thank you very much. Good to see you all. Take care. Enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you. Good
Cheers.
evening, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Sonia,
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Shuri.